Welcome to the Red Dice Diaries, and in this RPG review I'm going to be looking at Mutant Chronicles 3rd edition, a techno-fantasy role-playing game by Modiphius Entertainment. Now the version I'm looking at is a 496 page colour PDF, and Modiphius were kind enough to send me a review copy. The game uses their 2D20 system and is available from DriveThruRPG in PDF format for $19.95 US, which is just over £14 in British money at the time of recording. I'll put a link to where you can get that from DriveThru in the description below, and the PDF and print copies are also available from Modiphius' website. Again, link down below. The cover of the book shows a horde of characters firing slug throwers into a massed horde of what look like zombies with decaying Gothic style buildings behind them. The artwork is nice and colourful, and it depicts an intriguing mix of action, horror, technology and superstition that I'm keen to see if that carries forward into the actual game. We then move on to a stylised solar system map, which looks very striking and shows transit routes throughout the game setting. The game moves straight into explaining what you need to play. These include the more obvious things like paper and pencil, along with some things that not all RPGs require, like beads and tokens. It's good to have this quick checklist though, especially for people who are less familiar with RPGs and may not know the standard list of kit for running a role-playing session. The tokens or beads are used to track two different resource pools during the game: Chronicle points and Dark Symmetry points. Chronicle points are a player resource that allows PCs to succeed against overwhelming odds or do spectacular things that mock them apart from normal people. Dark Symmetry points are used by the GM to introduce additional complications and challenges into the game. Mutant Chronicles is described as a diesel punk techno fantasy game, which is a bit of a mouthful, so the writers have thoughtfully provided a breakdown of what these terms mean and how they relate to each other. Essentially, mankind's advanced machines have turned against them, so older tech has been dusted off and repaired to keep civilization moving. The Mutant Chronicles background has spawned two previous editions of the RPG, some miniatures games and even a collectible card game. I must admit this is my first exposure to Mutant Chronicles, although I have heard of the related war game Warzone. That the game has been through previous editions and is still going strong is a positive sign for the background and the longevity of the setting, in my opinion. Previous editions of the RPG seem to have focused on different eras of the setting, whereas 3rd edition leaves that decision more in the hands of the GM, splitting the timeline into three distinct periods. Number one is the Dark Symmetry period, where the mankind's at the apex of their technology. Dark Symmetry has just started to appear and has begun to turn tech against mankind. Number two is the Dark Legion era, and this is the setting of the original RPG and the Warzone miniatures game. And finally, Dark Eden, looking at the very height of the conflict against Dark Symmetry, a period only sort of briefly touched on in previous editions of the RPG. Now, the introduction paints a brief picture of a number of corporate factions who employ various freelancers and are opposed by the Dark Apostles, creatures from an alien dimension hell-bent on conquest and destruction. We also get a brief capsule rundown of the planets in the setting. Earth itself has been rendered almost lifeless and largely uninhabitable, with most fleeing from the mother planet. The second chapter of the book begins by breaking down the various corporations that have dominated human society since the rush to escape from the dead Earth. As in a fair few dystopian settings, these businesses have become corporate nation-states, ruling humanity in their own way. Capital is a bold, confident corporation that views itself as the inheritor of the American dream. Bauhaus is influenced by Germanic, Scandinavian and European culture, and they pride themselves on efficiency. Mishima embodies the culture of shogunate Japan, but combined with the focus on honour, sacrifice and duty, and the power of 20th century Japan. Imperial is an aggressive, expansionist coalition of clans with strong British and Commonwealth roots. It was employees of Imperial who unwittingly freed the Dark Legion from its ancient prison during their explorations of distant Pluto. Cybertronic are something of a newcomer, appearing in the Dark Legion time period. They are formed of defectors from the other corporations, mainly Bauhaus, but with small groups of members from other corps. They attempt to embrace technology in a universe that doesn't entirely trust it anymore. There are also other factions not directly related to the corporations. There is White Star, led by the Tsarina from her stronghold in Siberia. The brutal soldiers of White Star range out from dead Earth into space, seeking vengeance against those who abandon the planet. The Cartel are a neutral meeting and mediation place for the corporations. It's a hotbed of espionage, and they were responsible for the creation of the Doom Troopers during the First Dark Legion War. There is the Brotherhood, who began as a charitable organisation in the Dark Symmetry time period. They have become a religion focused on protecting humanity from the Dark Legion, using supernatural powers known as arts. And finally, Lunar PD, an investigative body that recruits from the population of Lunar and that often hires freelancers to expand their talent pool. This chapter contains handy relationship diagrams showing which organisations are allied with or enemies of others. I can see these being very useful memory aids for a GM during a game, although I'm not sure if the diagrams change during the various time periods covered by the RPGs. Chapter 3 provides a more detailed timeline of the Mutant Chronicles setting. There are GM references dotted throughout the section, which link to areas at the end of the chapter, providing a GM-only overview of events. This is a nice idea, keeping player and GM info separate, although I'd have liked it if the GM references were hyperlinked to make it easier to flick between them using the PDF, but this is a fairly minor niggle. The timeline paints a dystopian picture of a dying world, stripped bare by corporations who control the destiny of mankind. Eventually, the corporations abandon Earth, terraforming other worlds. On Earth, Russia closes its borders and begins to construct underground facilities, allowing them to survive on the ruined planet. As the corporations expand outwards, many hundreds of years later, they launch an expedition to return to Earth, only to be met by deadly force from White Star, who see the corporations as traitors who abandon the motherland. A dark artifact is eventually discovered by Imperial on Pluto and is excavated. The first archaeologist to touch it with his bare hand dies, and a transmission known as the Big Scream causes AIs across the galaxy to malfunction and systems to overload, collapsing corporate society. The timeline for Mutant Chronicles is extensive, as you might expect from a game that has multiple incarnations and offshoots. It goes into far more depth and detail than the brief taster I've just given you. The background uses a number of sci-fi tropes that most fans of the genre will be comfortable with: corrupt corporations, an ecologically devastated Earth, a shadowy extra-dimensional presence, etc, etc. The background for the game reminds me very much of the Warhammer 40k background. It's by no means a direct copy, but its use of retro technology combined with elements of horror and alien menace definitely have a familiar feel. This is not a bad thing, since these elements work really well together when handled properly. The setting of Mutant Chronicles is very humanocentric. You're not going to find the vast array of aliens and such like you might find in some other science fiction games. However, I don't think this is a bad thing for this sort of game. The focus on humanity really allows the designers to zoom in on how humanity functions in their setting in extensive detail without having to cover additional species and their societies. The aliens in the system are a shadowy menace that threatens humanity, providing not only a ready-made antagonist in Mutant Chronicles games, but also this sort of monolithic force that seems to be never truly defeated permanently, but that can be locked away at great costs, granting humanity brief periods of respite from the horror. As a massive fan of cosmic horror and the whole fighting for small victories against a massive foe idea, I really like this, and I can see the suspicion and undermining of the apostles and their cults providing rich fodder for games. Chapter 4 covers the core mechanics of the system. Essentially, Mutant Chronicles uses an attribute and skill-based system, where to make a basic skill check, the player rolls two 20-sided dice, or D20, and tries to roll equal to or lower than the skill's associated attribute on one or both of the dice. If a PC is skilled in a certain area, then their ranks of expertise are added to the test attribute, making it more likely you'll get under it and thus you'll pass the test. The game also uses 6-sided dice known as dark symmetry dice. These are standard d6s but with the 6 replaced by a dark symmetry icon. When these dice are rolled, results of 1 or 2 are added to the roll normally, 3, 4 and 5 are ignored, and a result of 6, or the dark symmetry symbol, generates a dark symmetry point. The system also measures levels of success. Rolling equal to or less than your relevant attribute gains you 1 success, however skill training can improve your focus and gain you an extra success. The example given in the book is that someone with intelligence 9 and science expertise 2 would have to roll 11 or less on his 2d20 to get 1 success. However, if he had science focus 2, if any of these dice rolled a 1 or a 2, the player would receive an additional success. There are also talents, equipments and other game aspects that can increase the number of successes generated. The number of successes is most important when facing a very difficult task. However, if you gain more levels of success than required, any extra are converted into momentum that can be spent to improve the magnitude or quality of the outcome. Chronicle points are also covered. They refresh each session and are also rewarded for good roleplay and overcoming challenges. They are used to add an auto success to a skill check, perform an additional action, or even to recover from light wounds. Dark symmetry points are used as a resource by the GM, representing the abilities of certain NPCs and the fluctuating nature of evil in the setting. Certain failed rolls can add to the dark symmetry pool, or players can choose to do so to either improve their odds or to mitigate the worst effects of failure. The GM can then spend these points to activate NPC abilities or to introduce complications into the game. Chapter 5 gets down to the nitty-gritty of actually creating a character within the system. Characters in the game are defined by 8 attributes: agility, awareness, coordination, intelligence, mental strength, personality, physique and strength. These provide the default target number the player must roll below to succeed at tasks. This is modified, as I said earlier, by their ranks in skill expertise. Characters are built using a life path method where various choices, or random elements if you choose to use that option, determine things like the corporation your PC grew up as a member of and their place in society. This in turn affects characters' abilities and additional elements that get added onto the character. Now, I quite like this. It reminds me of the Traveller character creation method. However, here it allows enough choice to satisfy those who want to design specific characters, but those who like just randomly playing what they roll can equally do so. The life path determines not only stats, but also adds additional elements of background, such as corporate rivals and the neighbourhood you grew up in. All useful stuff that gives you a boost on creating a character background that works within the Mutant Chronicles mythos. Carrying through the 2d20 rolls to a lot of the background table ensures that there is a wealth of options available for from playing the unlikely scion of a crime family to a gifted student working for a noted scientist. An additional area of interest in this chapter are iconic careers, and these are sort of like major professions in the Mutant Chronicles. A player can attempt to have their character enter these careers as part of their life path, assuming that they meet the prerequisites and pass the described skill check. There's a wide variety of iconic careers, from heretics, undercover agents of the Dark Apostles, to merchant captains. The most popular sci-fi archetypes, marines, nobles, space traders, tech merchants, etc., are all covered here, along with some interesting twists like the Mishima corporate samurai. Chapter 6 covers how to award experience points and other gameplay awards. Essentially, the players receive chronicle points for good roleplay or for progression in a campaign. These points are then used to give the characters an edge during sessions. Experience points are awarded for completing key encounters, stopping their enemies, or for other achievements. The game recommends 300 to 500 experience points as an appropriate award for a 3 to 4 hour session. Experience points are spent to improve attributes, skills and acquire new talents as the character grows and advances. Talents are represented by talent trees, showing the order in which they must be acquired. Now, whilst not a new idea, talent trees are a nice, clear way of showing this information in a very sort of visual way. Moving on to Chapter 7, we see that there's a more in-depth look at the various skills and talents used in the system, along with some additional guidelines for setting the difficulty of dice rolls. A nice extra wrinkle is that when one of the d20s rolled for a test comes up as a 20, then a complication occurs regardless of whether the result was a success or not, which is entirely possible since the other d20 could have had a successful result. The skill descriptions are all concisely and neatly written. Some additional information is also given regarding hostile conditions and fatigue in this chapter. Chapter 8 goes into more detail about spending memento, which, if you remember, I mentioned earlier. When you get extra successes on a roll, these additional successes become memento. It can be spent to gain additional benefits on your skill checks, and some suggestions related to individual skills are made in the previous chapter. Momentum can also be donated to a group pool to represent tactics, leadership, and other such things that benefit the group as a whole. This pool is available to anyone in the group, but it slowly fades away as scenes pass and the adrenaline or energy of the group fades. I think this is a cool way to represent group cohesion using the system without making it very complicated. It would rely on players' willingness to donate to the pool, however, so it may not really see much use for certain parties. Chapter 9 covers Chronicle points in more detail, how to award them and where they can be spent, whilst Chapter 10 covers the type of actions that are commonly encountered or undertaken in a Mutant Chronicles game. Now, in this chapter, the game wears its heart in its sleeve, attempting to create mechanics that allow for a fast-paced, action-packed type of game, and I certainly don't think it's a bad thing when a game puts its intentions up front in this way, since it allows the reader to make an informed decision. And after all, that's why I'm here reviewing things, so that you, the role-playing public, can make these informed decisions. So it's nice to see the game itself doing that, and I think that's a big plus for Mutant Chronicles. Chapter 10 covers combat, proceeding largely in a manner that you'd expect from an RPG. It takes place in rounds, covering an abstract amount of time. An interesting omission was an initiative system. The game suggests just letting the players decide the order in which their actions proceed, then the GM moves his NPCs afterwards. I think this is an interesting idea, and it could work great with the right group. I've certainly played initiativeless systems before, and as long as there isn't so much debate about the order that it bogs down the game, they generally work fine and save on additional dice rolling. I love the fact that in Mutant Chronicles, the GM has the opportunity to spend dark symmetry points to interrupt the player's order of action and have one of his NPCs out. This will be great for representing a powerful or climactic opponent, or even just highly trained NPCs. The combat rules in Mutant Chronicles are fairly extensive, as you'd expect from a sci-fi game with all the various technology potentially available in such a setting, and it does seem to me, although it would definitely benefit miniatures or a map of some sort. The authors have attempted to provide for those who wish to run Mutant Chronicles via the Theatre of the Mind style, using a system of abstracted battlefield zones that can be used to note relative positioning. I think this is a wise choice, since it opens the game up a little more for people who either prefer not to use miniatures or for whom it's not possible or practical. Chapter 12 is about damage, wounds and healing, providing more detail on weapon damages, normally a static figure added to a number of dark symmetry dice, how momentum can be spent to increase damage, and the source of protection that warriors in the Mutant Chronicles universe wear to attempt to stave off the worst damage. The game uses a hit location system. Essentially, when someone rolls to attack, the players also roll a d20 to determine the location of their hit, although some talents can alter this. They roll damage and then reduce this number by any armour worn by their target on the affected location. Any damage remaining after this becomes wounds inflicted on the target. A character dies when all of his critical wound boxes are crossed off, or if they take a critical injury that generates a death result. Critical injuries are generated when a character has crossed off one or more critical wound boxes and are determined by rolling on a d20 table, generating effects that run the gamut from a slight case of bleeding to a grisly and painful death. Chapter 13 covers mental strain and madness. Effectively, mental health is measured by a tracker, although this is not split between different hit locations as with physical damage. Whenever a character faces a traumatic situation, they make a willpower roll based on the severity of the event. Failure results in a condition being imposed on the character that persists until healed, either by rest or psychiatric therapy. Chapter 14 deals with the Dark Symmetry pool, providing an overview of the system and how the GM can get the most out of it during their games of Mutant Chronicles. Essentially, as the pool grows, it should reinforce a sense of dread amongst the players, since it means the GM has more option to introduce complications and make their lives difficult. Without going into too much detail, since I don't want to spoil it for anyone who's planning to play or run a Mutant Chronicles session, the GM receives Dark Symmetry points based on the actions of the players, or when generated by certain plot elements. They can then be spent to cause equipment malfunctions, environmental effects, to interrupt player initiative in combat, and other stuff like that. Following on from this, Chapter 15 covers how people, places, and even technology can be corrupted by Dark Symmetry, providing a system the GM can use to determine, first of all, whether corruption has taken place, and if so, to what level it has rooted itself in the place or person. In Chapter 16, we discover that those corrupted or who willingly give their souls to the darkness can gain access to dark gifts granted by their superiors. A large list of such gifts then follows, presented in the standard format used for talents, etc. throughout the book. These abilities cover powers from warping space to travelling more swiftly to casting your enemies into a sanity-shattering void between dimensions. Chapter 17 covers the Art of the Light, essentially a magical talent innately possessed by some who are then located and educated by the religious brotherhood during their childhood. This ability is unlocked by certain choices during the creation of a character's life path, and it requires a considerable amount of dedication to master the talent. There is a menacing picture of a Brotherhood member on page 169, wearing concealing armour and robes, and with blue fire flickering around a closed fist. This pretty much tells you what you need to know about the Brotherhood. Although engaged in an attempt to preserve the soul of humanity from the darkness, they're not friendly friars by any means, but powerful warriors of light, willing to do what is necessary to save humanity as a whole, even if that means some must be sacrificed. Chapters 18 and 19 deal with vehicles and spacecraft respectively, providing statistics for various space-going vessels, walkers, wheeled and tracked vehicles, along with additional variations for running combats featuring them. These chapters seem very comprehensive, using a similar zone system to that described earlier in the combat chapter. However, some additional complications are introduced due to matters of scale. This is pretty much a given when vehicles and spacecraft are introduced. I've yet to see a system that doesn't get at least a little more complicated under these circumstances. To its credit though, Mutant Chronicles does try and keep the additional rules to a minimum, providing additional actions that various crew members can perform. This is great for keeping players involved, since one thing I have observed with some systems is that unless you're the pilot or the gunner, you can end up sort of twiddling your thumbs a bit during a prolonged space combat. Chapter 20 is a weapons, equipment and gear chapter, providing a large list of qualities that such equipment may possess, and Chapter 21 is a huge inventory of weapons. This is serviceable and will no doubt be useful during a game. This is a sort of chapter I always think it must be really difficult for authors to make interesting, since really it's just a big list of stats. But I do like the fact that Mutant Chronicles provides some guidance on how the technologies produced by different factions differ in aesthetics and functionality. This is interesting and has some great story potential, as well as just adding an extra layer to the background of the game. The illustrations of weapons throughout the chapter are nice and clear, showing the aesthetic the game designers are going for. That sort of dark, futuristic feel where everything is dusty, slightly outdated and decayed. Chapter 22 is pretty similar to Chapter 21, but covers armour and protective measures, whereas Chapter 23 goes on to describe how to acquire goods and trade in Mutant Chronicles. The authors have made the wise choice, in my opinion, not to focus too much on an in-depth economic model, which personally I know I particularly wouldn't find very interesting, and instead use an abstract asset system to represent wealth and earnings. To locate and purchase something, a character needs to make a lifestyle check. Success means they acquire it, and obviously you can spend momentum to reduce the cost or reduce the time it takes to locate the item, whilst a failure means the item is unavailable unless the player character spends some of their assets to make up the difference, representing them eating into their savings to make up the shortcomings. Chapter 24 details various everyday expenses and costs of items in the Mutant Chronicles universe. Some of the items in this chapter are primitive versions of real-world technology, whilst others are more fantastic, and this really helps to reinforce the scattergun nature of tech in the Mutant Chronicles universe, and the whole dark retro future feeling that pervades the rest of the game. You might have a cybernetic eye and a wicked slug thrower, but your mobile phone's going to be this size and it's probably going to have a huge battery pack going forward. And this is a really interesting juxtaposition in my opinion. We then move on to chapter 25, which is all about the adversaries and opponents that the PCs might face in Mutant Chronicles, and begins with some advice on how GMs can create NPCs in the system. Essentially, you use the life path system mentioned earlier in this review, and then once they've been created, an additional template called a target category, based on the role they're going to occupy in the game, is added on top of this. And these target categories are troopers, elites, hordes and squads, and nemesis. The game also recommends using broad skill categories for NPCs, since having the individual skill lists isn't really necessary. And I think this is a very valid method to help streamline the many NPCs that come into play in a typical RPG session. The rest of the chapter is a few pages of instant NPCs with stats. There aren't a great deal of them in this core book, but I expect that other books in the Mutant Chronicles line will add to this. In chapter 26, we find out about the history of humanity as it's tied to the Dark Apostles and the dark soul behind them itself, covering the discovery of the ancient deadly monolith and its effects on technology, to the emergence of the Dark Apostles and their forces stretching their hands forward across the stars like futuristic horsemen of the apocalypse. The Dark Apostles represent an intriguing and unsettling fusion of biological and mechanical, with a healthy dash of ancient magics and evil thrown in for good, or rather bad, measure. Although capable of infecting technology and warping it, they also cause those slain by their legions to rise in death and serve them as unliving warriors known as the Dark Legion. Lurking behind them we have this extra-dimensional dark soul, a huge and unknowable cosmic horror with aims that can only be guessed at by mere mortals. Chapter 27 covers the Dark Legion in more detail, the forces of the Dark Apostles, undead horrors and biomechanical hybrids, infused with the power of dark symmetry and dedicated to the goals of whatever apostle they serve. This chapter is interesting, although I'm not sure how much it will be used by games that weren't combat intensive, since a lot of the Dark Legion aren't exactly subtle, they're physically obvious, and they seem to have been created mainly as soldiers, although I could certainly see them adopting the roles of summoned demons for a cult of heretics. I like that each of the Dark Apostles have different methods and different minions, since it means you can focus on whatever suits your particular game, whether that be the Master of Mutation and Dark Technology, Algaroth, or the creeping pestilence of Demnagonis. Chapter 28 covers Lunar City in extensive detail, laying out the default setting for the game. Humanity has terraformed the moon and constructed a giant city on it that is split between territories of the various corporations. The city is vast and essentially an entirely urban campaign world, with its own perils in all eras of the Mutant Chronicle timeline. In addition to providing historical information, this chapter also contains numerous box outs with important information such as the day-to-day cost of living, and also providing commentary on how sections of Lunar City society may have differed in the various time periods. The map of Lunar City provided is done in quite an old-fashioned style for a science fiction game, but given that Mutant Chronicles has an anachronistic mix of ancient and futuristic, it works really well, conveying the huge scope of the setting. Chapter 29 is all about living life as a freelancer, someone who doesn't work directly for the corporations, accepting work on a contract-by-contract basis. This type of roaming agent certainly seems tailor-made for player characters, and I can see why it was the default mode of play for one of the earlier editions of the game, giving the PCs more autonomy, but without them having to completely sever all ties with the corporations and the rich roleplay that has to offer. The chapter breaks down some of the most common types of operations for freelancers and provides some additional details on the everyday life of such people and how they arrange their payments. Chapters 30 to 37 provide gazetteer style information on the various factions and corporations that are prominent in the Mutant Chronicles universe, giving a potted history for each, discussing an overview of their territories and their relationship with other factions. Again, this is great for fine-tuning your game. Do you want a post-apocalyptic game where beleaguered PCs battle mutants and cobble together tech from the ruins of the old Earth? Then run a White Star-themed campaign. Fancy a high-tech espionage game? Then Cybertronic has you covered. Whereas if it's religious devotion and rooting out heresy that gets you going, then Chapter 37 on the Brotherhood will get you moving in the right direction. In the next chapter, we are given some pointers on how the setting has changed in the various different eras of play covered by this book. This is very interesting because it lets you see how the actual effects of the historical events mentioned elsewhere have had on the game and how they can have an impact on your game. After all, what good is a rich and diverse history if it leaves your game world unaffected? Chapter 39 is a Gamemastering chapter and begins by outlining the responsibilities of a GM, along with some basic advice for anyone looking to run a Mutant Chronicles game. There won't be anything here to really surprise people who have roleplayed before, but the advice is good, it's solid, and there are some interesting pointers for different styles of games that can be encompassed by Mutant Chronicles. Given that there is so much information in this book, I think it's very wise of the authors to give some guidelines here. I also like the fact that failing forward, the idea that failing a dice roll doesn't always mean complete and utter failure, and something I've talked about a fair bit before, is covered in some detail in this chapter. Chapter 40 offers some great advice on how to use zone mapping in combats and some useful tips on framing combats, whereas Chapter 41 goes into detail about how to write adventures and campaigns for the Mutant Chronicles game, offering suggestions for taking inspiration from modern day life and linking adventures to form episodic campaigns using a sort of TV series model. A selection of campaign themes are offered, and these are quite interesting and are normally framed against a backdrop of two or more competing factions. The book then rounds off with some rules reference sheets and some nice uncluttered character sheets. So, in conclusion, I think comparisons with the universe of Warhammer 40,000 are almost inevitable, especially given that Fantasy Flight Games currently has RPGs out based in that universe, and the two do share several points of comparison. Ancient extra-dimensional evils, a war for Earth, anachronistic technology levels, and psychic/magical powers. However, I do think the Mutant Chronicles has a lot to recommend it to people looking for a science fiction role-playing game. So here are the positive and negative points of the system as I see them. We'll start with the negatives, of which, to be honest, there aren't really that many, so that we can end on the positive points. Okay, so negatives. There is a lot in this book to digest, and so it'll probably take you a little while reading it before feeling confident in your knowledge. However, the game is rewarding enough to justify that effort. And number two, some areas of the rules do feel a little bit more like a skirmish miniatures game, which is fine if you like that sort of thing. More power to you, crack on and enjoy yourself. But it's not really my bag. However, those couple of negatives, let's push them aside since they're far outweighed by the positives this system brings to the table. Number one, there's an awful lot of stuff in the book. And I might hear you saying, but didn't you say that was a negative earlier? Well, it does mean that the initial learning curve is a little bit steep. However, it also means there's a lot you can pull on, a lot of ideas and good stuff in there. And you can easily focus on the elements that appeal to you or exclude elements you don't like to change the focus of the game to what you want to look at, making it very customizable. Number two, the basic rule system is very simple to understand and use. The background of the game is very interesting and has that sort of well-rounded feel. that tells you that it's been built on and worked on by a lot of different people and built up over a number of years. The individual factions in the game are all interesting and have a lot of potential for roleplay built into them. And last but by no means least, the book is nicely laid out with some unintrusive artwork and very clearly printed text. It is also very, very reasonably priced for just the sheer volume of material that you get into it. So in conclusion, if you're looking for a science fiction game with a mostly not too crunchy rule system that has had a lot of work put into it over the years, and you're not afraid to wade into the lore of the setting, then you'll almost certainly have a blast running Mutant Chronicles, and you will get a lot out of it for your investment of time. So, thanks again to Modiphius for sending me this review copy. I hope if you out there watching have enjoyed this review, you'll consider clicking on the red dice up there to subscribe to my channel. You can find us at www.reddicediaries.com and follow us on all our social media. I'll put links to those in the description down below. And as always, if you have any suggestions or comments, please either put them in the comments box down below or hit me up in Google Plus or on any of the other social media listed down below. I really do enjoy reading what you write. So until I see you next time, take care and happy gaming.